we have this questions we take on. So the question is, will you give me a drink? Now for me in this text, the most important point when that is asked is really from the woman to Jesus. Will you give me this ever-living water? I think it's really important because part of what we do as the greater Christian church is we have this living water that we are to give freely to others. And we live in a time in which there is so much thirst. Right? People thirst for community. People thirst for authenticity. People thirst for a purpose. People thirst for a meaning of life. People thirst for all these things. They spend billions of dollars on books and TED Talks and conferences trying to pursue these things, right? And we have all these things. And yet there's a huge disconnect. Because how is it that we have a world that wants it, a church that has it, a church that says they wish to give it, and then it doesn't seem to totally really happen, right? In a lot of places, if not the majority of them. I think one of the major contributing factors to how we end up not giving the drink that's requested is that churches are places where weird little nonsensical proxy battles occur all the time. What do I mean? Well, think about it. Think of the dumbest argument you have ever seen. Bet you money it was in a church. Right? Only in churches do people get mad about colors of carpet. Right? Only in churches, and you can fill that in with so many things, right? When I say proxy, the best example of this outside of church, well, sort of outside church, would be like the 1980s, okay? I'm a kid of the 80s and 90s, and in the 1980s and 90s, Catholics and Protestants around the world were living in perfectly good peace for hundreds of years, except one place, Ireland, right? Ireland. And if you went and you just sort of took a surface look, you'd be like, well, Catholics and Protestants hate each other. But it wasn't really a Catholic versus Protestant thing, was it? No. You had this deep pain of a war that had lost part of Ireland to the United Kingdom. And deep pain of people killed on both sides of the Northern Ireland debate. And so when people would say I'm Catholic, they didn't mean they followed the Pope. Or if people said I'm Protestant, didn't mean that they followed the Archbishop of Canterbury. Both of them spoke out against it year after year after year after all. What they meant is one believed in the unification of Ireland and one didn't. It was politics, not theology. It was ideology, not religion, at play. But religion became the proxy. Why? Because it was a lot easier to say, well, Catholics hate Protestants and Protestants hate Catholics, than it was to go ahead and admit and talk about the complicated, bloody, terrifying history that was the occupation and succession of Northern Ireland through a series of wars. We in the church have these proxy wars. Probably the greatest of all of them is traditional versus contemporary. Right? See, y'all laugh in recognition, right? How many times, usually it's with music, but how many times has this die been cast where you have, I'm traditional and therefore, I'm contemporary and therefore, right? But these are nonsense. Let's take music, since that's probably the most popular one. We'll take that. Let's dig into that for a moment. Contemporary and traditional are nonsense words in the world of music. What do I mean? Well, okay, so traditional music. Most traditional in church is no music, but since people do say traditional music, what I hear you all saying is Gregorian chants. Anybody? Got one Gregorian chant vote. But the reality is the people who say traditional don't mean Gregorian chants most of the time, right? Let's take on contemporary for a moment because it's an equally non-word. Okay, so contemporary technically just means like new, or at least new-ish. So rock and roll got beaten out by rap like more than a decade ago when it came to the most popular form of music. So what you're telling me is you would like us to rap together. Okay? I got like 3 yeses. Okay? Or just simply do a series of TikTok challenges because that's honestly where people spend their time in a contemporary world. Right? Okay? Yeah, that's not what you mean either. All right? what people really mean most of the time, or most of the people most of the time, when you say traditional, what people will say when you push them on the Gregorian chant thing is they'll clarify. They're like, no, I love the organ. I love hymnody. I want to sing multi-leveled harmonies. Fair? When people say contemporary, they do not want me rapping up here, which, trust me, you really don't. I'm a 40-year-old white man from Texas. You do not want to see me try, okay? What you really mean is like classic rock. Maybe a little folk, maybe a little country, but in that genre, right? That's what you mean when you say contemporary. So that's fine. Traditionals, basically you're saying classical music, like in the classical music station. Contemporary, what you're basically saying is classic rock, man. Right? But here's the problem. If you add up all the hours on Spotify of people listening to classical music and all the hours on Spotify of people listening to classic rock, that is only about 25% of the hours, guys. That means 75% is something other, which makes sense because there's a lot out there besides classical music and classic rock. I grew up in San Antonio, Texas. You know what San Antonio, Texas is? Music capital of Tejano music, my friends. And you know what? What does that fit into? Nowhere. Neither does New Orleans Zydeco. Neither does jazz. Neither does blues. Neither does gospel. Neither does any number of other things. R&B, rap. We can just go category by category here. None of them fit. Because we're only really talking about a small segment of the musical world. But why? I think it's because, and I keep telling people this, like the number one movie to understand what is wrong in mainline Protestantism today is Encanto. So if you haven't seen Encanto, go watch Encanto. Our leadership was Abuela for a long, long time, and we have problems, okay? And part of the problem is this. When you talk of Lutheran history, we in America, we are very happy to talk about the immigration to Buffalo and Delaware and Albany, New York before the Revolution. We will even talk during the revolutionary times of people like Muhlenberg, right? We love Muhlenberg around here. He's like our patron saint of the Lehigh Valley, okay? And we will talk about him, and then we'll go on to talk about the immigrations through Chicago and Milwaukee and all these places and how you had all these Germans and Swedes and Norwegians settle the Midwest. And then we will stop talking in the story, and we'll pick back up in the good old days, which is approximately 1948. And then we'll talk about the 1940s and 1950s and maybe the 1960s as the good old days, and then we'll talk about how everything fell apart after the good old days started to end in 1980. With people like me being born. Okay? You notice there's a huge missing time period, 1890 to 1948. We don't talk about that. I bet you if I gave you a quiz on what did Lutheranism look like between 1890 and 1948, you all would probably not know much of anything because we don't talk about that. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about Bruno. Here's the thing. It was a horrible time to be a Lutheran. 1890, the vast majority of Lutherans are within the first 3 generations of immigrating to the U.S. Proof in Point, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, had 4 newspapers. 3 were in German. Okay? Not too different in 1890 out here. Immigration was a little earlier, maybe slightly lower percentage of native tongues spoke. Then came the First World War. First World War was brutal for Lutherans of Germanic heritage, which is the majority of Lutherans. Lutheran churches were ransacked. Lutheran churches were burnt. This often was the people in the town. It often was their other Lutherans. Lutheran churches at that point, denominations for the most part, were ethnocentric. You had the Swedish Lutherans and the German Lutherans and the Slovak Lutherans. This is before the LCA and ALC existed. This is back when we were 39 different denominations. This was hard times. After the First World War ends, you have the intra-war time period, the Roaring '20s, and there's a huge divide that grows in Lutheranism. One side said, that was horrible. We need to assimilate and drop our cultural values and our cultural traditions as quickly as we can so this never happens again. You probably know grandparents and great-grandparents who their parents said, stop speaking German. You had another group that said, no, I'm reclaiming this. I'm going to love what it means to be German. And you had the Bunds start, or the Bunderland organization start. This is where you start going into two different directions. One group says we need to assimilate. That's when hot dogs became American, so did hamburgers, not German food. And bratwurst became American, not German. Chicken fried steak became American, not German. Texas barbecue became American, not German. So that's probably more rightfully Czech. Here's the thing. One group went that direction. The other group went ahead and said we should be proud of it. They created the Bunderlands. The Bunderlands, and that's part of the dark heritage of ours. The Bunderlands became overly fascinated with Nazism. 20,000 people of American Bunderland got together in Central Park in 1936 to celebrate Hitler's election. Tens of thousands will join the Nazi army when the war breaks out. This brings great shame to so many. And there was horrible. When World War II breaks out, the anti-German sentiment was horrific. When I served in Betrayal, Nebraska, I talked to a guy who was 101 years old back then. And he told me, everyone always says, I don't understand why Smithfield, that was a town down the road, will never do anything with ours. There's a Lutheran church there. He said, I can totally explain. And I said, well, why? He said, well, every Good Friday, starting the First World War to the end of the Second World War, the tradition was us Swedes would all get together, go down there, ransack their church, take their German flag out, put it in the front, and light it on fire. That's what you did on Good Friday. That's how you celebrated Easter. Beat up the Germans. Yeah, they're fellow Lutherans, 7 miles away. Why? Because they were terrified too. They wanted to make sure that everyone knew that the Swedish they talked was not German. They wanted no association, so they created violence. It was a horrible time. So when the 1940s came around, those good old days, leadership looked around and said, man, how do I make sure this never happens again? They said, well, first let's unite everybody. By then, the LCA and the ALC had been created, and the ELCA, which exists now, already starts getting thought of. People start talking about that. People start talking about getting mergers together so that things can happen. What ends up happening is the leadership looks around and says, we need to ditch anything that's particularly Germanic in origin. First thing we're going to do is we're going to come out and we're going to say, let's get rid of speaking German in church. Some of you are old enough to probably remember that time. Huge pressure from the bishop's offices. Stop speaking German, speak English already. Many of you may remember, get rid of all your German saints. A lot of those German saint days, no one celebrates anymore. They all spoke Pennsylvania Dutch, but only at home. So grandma could understand what you were saying. It also was what was behind the whole movement to try to get Lutherans away from the Reformed UCC folks. We know lots of churches around here were originally union churches, right? But there was a whole movement from 50s to the 70s trying to break those unions up. So the Lutherans go be Lutheran. What they meant was get them away from the German UCC folks too. What did they do? They gave us a false sense of what tradition was. They picked traditions from the 39 traditions that existed. This from that, that from this from that. And then they came out and said, this has always been our tradition. This is what it always will be. This is tradition. The problem is, well, each one was a tradition. None of our traditions were universal among those 39 denominations. The reason there were 39 of them. It gave a really false assumption. The false assumption is that you can look at any given action and say, all Lutherans have always done blank. Because the reality is, there's virtually nothing in there. And definitely nothing we actually care about. but it's actually controversial. But once you set up and you say, this is tradition, then you can define everything that isn't this as contemporary. But since this isn't founded in anything except for a fear of violence, a need to try to quickly assimilate, to make sure it never happens again, this isn't really a thing. That makes not this equally not a thing. The definitions don't matter. And the plaster is falling off the house, just like in Encanto. Because by making it this or that, we exclude mostly everybody. So as you go out today, I want to pose you the question we started with. Pose it to you as an individual, pose it to you as a congregation, pose it to you as a denomination, and pose it to you as the world of Christianity. Will you give people